Spoilers for The Bad Batch up to Season 2, Episode 12, The Outpost. So, Bad Batch Season 2 has been more or less the exact same thing as last season, which is to say, it's not great. We're still following the same generic band of characters on uninteresting side missions for an unlikable boss character that ultimately amount to nothing and barely even qualify as serviceable television. And if you're like me and you didn't like Season 1, then you're not really going to get anything different this time around, which is exactly what I was expecting. And it's why I'd already elected not to do a review of Season 2. There's just no sense in repeating myself. However, one of my biggest complaints of last season was about the character of Crosshair, whose morals and motivations have been so confusing and inconsistent that I would be lying if I said I thought he was a good character. At the beginning of the show, Order 66 went down and Crosshair seemed to be the only member of the Bad Batch to be experiencing the effects of the inhibitor chip, which was then amplified up to 11 when they were captured by the Imperials, turning Crosshair into the Bad Batch's enemy and setting him up to be the main antagonist for the season. Then toward the end of the season, they returned to Kamino in an attempt to remove his chip and restore him to his old self, only to find that actually, he'd already removed his chip and has been continuing to serve the Empire in spite of having regained access to his free will.
I had my chip removed a long time ago.
Which, I found a bit odd, to say the least. My main questions were, how was he allowed to do this? Why did he even want to while still under the chip's influence? And why did he then continue to serve the Empire after the fact, despite having been brainwashed and enslaved by them? How does any of that add up? Well, we weren't given any answers to a single one of these questions, but I said in the video that I'm perfectly ready for Season 2 to explain any gaps in this information. And of course, as people tend to always say when defending Dave Filoni, this show was only on Season 1, and it was likely to improve as it went on. Though for the time being, I couldn't exactly conclude that his character was in good shape with the context that we had. So it definitely came to me as a shock that, of the 13 episodes we've had thus far, Crosshair's only appeared in 2 this season. There are just as many, if not more, superfluous episodes with the Bad Batch going on pointless missions for Sid to pad the episode count. But when it comes to someone like Crosshair, who actually needs the screen time if there's any hope of salvaging this character, he's nowhere to be found for most of the season. I should also mention that my take on Crosshair received a fair amount of backlash, but most of the arguments boiled down to, this makes him more interesting than if he was just another clone being forced into service, which is appealing to a meta concept that I don't even really agree with. I mean, I don't see why one is more intrinsically compelling than the other. Either way, it's going to depend on the execution. And the fact of the matter is that I just don't think this reveal was executed all that well, because, as we're going to get into, it's inconsistent with what we know about Crosshair's character from before the Empire took over. But first things first, we gotta figure out a couple other things. How did Crosshair remove the chip, and why did he even want to? Well, I think those questions can actually be answered in one. His chip was fried when he got blasted in the face with rocket fuel on Braca, and it either weakened the chip's hold on him or disabled it entirely. Either way, it was easy enough from there for him to just do the rest and have actual incentive to do so. All I really want is for the show to confirm that, because as it stands, that's simply been the headcanon I've inferred based on context clues. But then, of course, once the chip is out of the picture, we're back to wondering why Crosshair continued to serve the Empire. And the thing is, I've heard some arguments here and there about why the fans think that he did it, and typically it's not a good look if you're having to force fans to infer characterization for you. But even then, I really don't think that most of these arguments are supported at all in the text, and many times they're even outright contradicted by what's established in the show. For example, I've heard people say that he chose to stay with the Empire because he's a born soldier and that's all he's ever known, which is an excuse you can make for pretty much any clone, so I'm not overly impressed by it personally. There are plenty of clones with the capacity to think for themselves in this post-Empire landscape who choose to continue the fight by going against the Empire. That way they can continue doing the only thing they feel they're capable of while also not serving a regime that enslaved and discarded their brothers.
I spent my life defending the Republic. Can't stop now. The Republic's going, Rex. Not all of it.
Throughout these 2 seasons, we've seen more and more clones overcome the effects of the chips. Evidently, they were only designed to temporarily keep the clones in line to wipe out the Jedi, and then gradually get phased out by the new conscripted troops, which makes total sense to me. Palpatine never intended to keep them in the long term, given their rapid aging process, which would make them unable to effectively enforce his will and, say, 20 more years. Not to mention the clones are just more costly, as Tarkin put it in episode 1 of the show. But as a result of the chips losing their hold, said clones who break free have all chosen to abandon the Empire the first chance they get. That's what happened with Commander Cody in episode 203, and we saw it back in season 1 when Hauser stood up in defiance of his orders because he recognized that they were wrong. These clones have a moral drive that overrides their conditioned obedience, and this is something that we've seen glimpses of as early as the Clone Wars. So then what's the deal with Crosshair? What kept him loyal to the Empire despite everything that I've already laid out and will continue to lay out as we proceed? Well, the simple answer is, I don't know. And the most recent episode that dealt with Crosshair's defection from the Empire didn't really do much to clarify these things. If anything, now I'm just more confused because the reason that Crosshair finally got sick of working for the Empire is because he realized they don't care about him or any of the other clones and are actively working to get rid of them, which is something that he already knew. Now, yes, throughout the episode, Crosshair went through a bit of a rough couple days, which is definitely something that added to him feeling stressed and overwhelmed in the moment. And all of that compounded with the frustration of knowing that he was regarded by his superiors as nothing more than a tool to be wielded. That's why he shot the lieutenant in that scene. The writing is on the walls. I'm not acting like it was hard to understand. I recognize that certain realizations that should have been obvious from the start sometimes only come to us in moments of duress. However, the point that I've been making all this time is that Crosshair had ample reason to have already concluded this for himself and absolutely zero reason to ever think the Empire was a good thing. Like, I actually had someone argue that he doesn't see much difference between the Republic and the Empire simply because of this one line.
Galactic Empire? We're soldiers of the Republic.
Republic, Empire. What's the difference?
Which, yes, when you take that line completely out of context, does support that claim. But that and every other moment with Crosshair in the pilot episode always seemed more like it was the chip talking and not actually him. There are several moments throughout the first episode where Crosshair is continually acting like a fascist thanks to his brainwashing, and Hunter calls him out on it.
An order is an order.
Since when? They sent us to eliminate innocent civilians.
Who said they're innocent?
What's wrong with you?
He had us disobey orders. I never thought you disobeying orders was a problem.
Yeah, we do it all the time.
These moments paint a pretty clear picture that Crosshair is acting extremely out of character from the perspective of the rest of the team, who knew him before Order 66. And there's a lot we can infer from that. It's pretty clear that Crosshair, along with the rest of the Bad Batch, isn't someone who has much regard for the concept of following orders, and would much prefer to just get the job done his way and move on to the next mission. Officially, the Bad Batch served the Republic, but they clearly weren't held on a very tight leash, and the very concept of working for a standing government is more of an abstract idea than anything else.
I know you work with Cody sometimes, but who do you guys report to? Good question. Can't say I've got an answer.
Don't ask me how any of that works, because I'm not even going to pretend to understand it. But my point is, you can't simply argue that Crosshair doesn't see much of a difference between the Republic and the Empire when one allowed them freedom and individuality, and the other brainwashed and enslaved him, chased the only family he's ever known into hiding, and destroyed his home planet. These are all things that Crosshair is fully aware of and doesn't seem to have much of an opinion on. But no, God forbid one fucking clone dies when he could have been saved. I hope you guys are starting to see what I'm getting at here. It's not necessarily that The Outpost was a bad episode. As a matter of fact, I think it works just fine as its own standalone story about two clones who realize their days are numbered and the Empire doesn't care about them. But when you look at it from a perspective of who Crosshair is and all the things he's done throughout the series, I just struggle to understand why I should care at this point. Like, yay, I'm really glad you finally committed to the only choice that made any sense for your character to begin with. What fucking took you so long? You guys remember back in that Battlefront game that came out a few years ago with the main characters defecting from the Empire and choosing the Rebellion? People got mad that we were getting yet another defector story because they wanted something new and original. But look, here's the thing. You can't really have a story where the main characters are Imperials unless they either defect by the end or are just bad people. People like to romanticize the concept of moral grayness, and there's definitely a place for that in Star Wars. But at the end of the day, the Empire is still a regime run by fascists, and anyone who fights for them or supports them in any way is supporting supporting fascistic tyranny, whether they realize it or not. And if they're good people, then when they're shown the truth that what they believe is wrong, they'll choose to abandon the Empire. But if they continue to serve the Empire after no longer being able to hide behind ignorance, they're either bad people or they're just making excuses to justify the bad things the Empire has done. What are Crosshair's excuses? Why does he choose to continue fighting for them when everything is saying that he shouldn't be? When the only family he's ever known is forced to run and hide and do petty mercenary work just to survive? When he was forced to forego his individuality and his capacity to choose in service of the people who wouldn't even bat an eye if he died tomorrow? All I'm asking for is an explanation that makes sense. All I want is for a character's motivations to be clear. People will say that Crosshair is an interesting character because we've seen so many clones who had no choice but to work for the Empire. This is new. This is something we've never seen before. And I don't see how you can actually think that that's enough when we don't even understand his reasons. It's times like these where I always find myself pointing back to Andor because, of course, if it's a deep and complex concept being explored in the Disney Star Wars era, the only thing doing it right is Andor. Once again, none of the people in this show who work for the Empire or who believe in it in any capacity are good people. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is that we understand who they are, what they believe, and why, and how said beliefs inform their desire for power or order, or any other thing that the Empire can give you. I understand why Cyril Karn believes in the Empire. He thinks that the galaxy is chaotic and lawless, and that strict and decisive enforcement of the law is the only countermeasure to rein it in. I understand the motivations of characters like Dedra Meero, who wants to rise to the top of the ISB and prove herself. She goes about this by undercutting her peers, doing the work, taking risks, and torturing any good-hearted citizens of some backwater planet that stands in the way of her goals. Remember how just a minute ago I said that you can't have an Imperial POV story without having said Imperial either defect or double down in being a bad guy? Well, Dedra is the perfect example of this. On the one hand, you have Iden Versio seeing that she's been serving a corrupt and evil regime and choosing to fight for freedom instead of order. Dedra, on the other hand, is perfectly willing to hurt innocent people if it means imposing order because all she cares about is power. She's not the main protagonist of the story, but in her particular storyline, she is. We're seeing how the ISB operates through her eyes. We're following her journey as she continues to gain favor with Major Partagaz. And sometimes it's easy to forget that she's not a good person because she's the protagonist. We're rooting for her because the way these scenes are presented make us feel bad for her every time one of her co-workers denies her key access to something that will aid her in her job or humiliates her in front of Partagaz. It's only when we cut back to these scenes where she inflicts her will on Bix that we remember, oh yeah, she's the bad guy. The point ultimately comes down to this. It's always going to be about perspective. And the great thing about characters is that they each have different ones. The best characters have motivations that are informed by their perspectives and the experiences they've had. What is Crosshair's perspective? Why does everything we know about him seem to conflict with the actions he takes? Is it a sign of bad writing, or is it just that we don't have the whole picture yet? Because I will confess, with Season 2 not yet finished, there is every chance that we'll still get explanations for these questions. But the problem is that I've been hearing that defense for this character since the end of Season 1, and I'm kind of tired of it. I want them to explain it, so in the coming weeks, if we're finally given actual answers, trust me, I'll be the first one doing backflips. But I specifically chose to make this video now so that you guys could go into the next set of episodes with this stuff in mind. Anyway, that's all I've got for you this time, so I'll catch you all on the flip side. And for any of you wondering, I know I said there might be a dry spell where you don't hear from me for a while as I continue to work on my big video, and that is still true. I'm working on it as we speak, and I have no idea when I'll upload again next, but we shall see. Anyway, goodbye.